Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today, and I want to talk a little bit more about 20th Century Boys. Now, last time when we talked about this manga, I brushed over some things I want to go back and catch up. I was really focused on the idea of the unity of story even after the time jump that established the era of 2014, which is when the third era of the story really begins. I think it runs through a couple of more years, but we'll discuss that as we get to it. And we were introduced to Kana, who is, of course, Kenji's niece and is kind of the protagonist of this era. For the most part, we will meet some other protagonists as time goes on. In fact, we're about to discuss one of them. But last week, we mostly talked about how Kana and her friend Cho, the detective, establish a sense of unity between the beginning of the story and this new era of the story. Adult Kana was, of course, introduced in the first few pages of the manga. We saw her confronting the specter of the giant robot that is responsible for Bloody New Year's Eve, which is the name given to the terrorist attack that happens on December 31st in the year 2000. So we have all of this unity, and that's really what I wanted to focus on when I was talking about this really important transition in the story. But there were a few other things that happened here that are kind of important. First of all, there was the murder of a gangster, a Chinese gangster in Shinjuku, which Kana got wrapped up in because that's where she works. And this also introduced us to the character of Father Nitani of Shinjuku Catholic Church, who you can see here. Father Nitani is an ex-gangster. He works with a lot of people in organized crime to try and lead them out of that life. He's a very honorable and respectful character. And in many ways, he's an interesting inversion of the character of Acho, who suffers a personal crisis and goes from a respectable lifestyle to a very criminal lifestyle, for lack of a better word, and partly because he meets a religious figure, namely a Buddhist monk, who helps him to understand the world better. And Father Nitani is almost the opposite of that. He lived a very unrespectable lifestyle. I'm going to open that up. Sorry about that. I don't want to re-record this, but you get a little bit of blurriness on the edges there. Anyways, Father Nitani lived in a very criminal lifestyle, and then he met the Pope, and he became, but we'll talk more about that later on. He did become a more respectable person as a result of that meeting. So this is the thing that prompts a meeting between Kana and Cho, Detective Chono, and it leads to some very important events in the second half of the story. But before we get too deeply into that, I also want to discuss when we are introduced to Yukiji in this modern era. She talks to some of Kana's neighbors, which include some manga artists. They mention that one of their friends has been put in jail, and we are about to meet him. So let's start there. There is the possibility for this character to be viewed as something of a self-insert. And I can see how it could be construed that way. It is about a manga artist, after all. He's telling a story very similar to the one we are reading here. I don't think that it's the purpose of this manga artist to be a stand-in for Naoki Urasawa. I believe he's there more as, for lack of a better term, a career stand-in. Urasawa is trying to articulate part of the reason why he thinks this society is so evil is for what it would do to him, and to show some of the biases and hangups that he as an artist is going to have while attempting to address this issue. I don't know as it really succeeds in this, but there it is. So here is our manga artist. He doesn't look really cool. He doesn't look really impressive. His name is Kakuta, and he's been put in jail because the manga he's writing doesn't reflect well on the FDP, which again is the ruling party, which is based around the old friend cult, which Kenji and company were fighting before Bloody New Year's Eve. And in fact, the story he's telling is basically the plot that Friend used to come to power, which is why Kakuta had to be done away with. But we know that there are a lot of other manga artists who have been arrested for telling stories that are not conducive to the health of the young generation, we're told. These really seem to be more stories that emphasize a heroic and self-sacrificial behavior in young people, which is something Friend seems to really want to avoid. Very interesting. Anyway, when Kakuta gets to prison, he's given a pencil by another inmate. He draws a couple of pictures, only to find out these things are contraband, and he gets put into solitary confinement. And one of the guards is kind of roughing him up and is going to break his hand when all of a sudden we see this nail coming out of another solitary confinement cell, pointing at his eye, and we realize that across the hall from Kakuta, in another solitary confinement cell, there is the monster of the prison. And not to beat around the bush, this eventually is revealed as Acho. Acho has been in prison since Bloody New Year's Eve, and he's been trying to get out all that time. And Kakuta is going to become the character we see this escape through. Now, it's interesting that Urasawa decides to introduce a new viewpoint character at this point to see Acho through, rather than telling us the story from Acho's perspective. Everyone from Kenji's generation, at least when we meet them in this time period, is not a viewpoint character. These people have aged to the point where, for the most part, they are advisors. They are the brains of the operation, but they are no longer physically quite capable of being the front line in the battle against evil. They have to provide the ideas, the techniques, the know-how, but it's up to the younger generation to implement those. And one of the things they have to struggle with, Kana and her allies, is whether they can trust these old people who didn't pull it off before. 20th Century Boys is a generational story, and one of the tensions between generations is that older people have seen things succeed, they have seen things fail, and they try to adjust their behaviors to take those things into account. But a lot of the times, they don't have the positions to implement those ideas or implement them fully. They're too old, they're not going to live long enough, they don't have the physical capability, and maybe some of the things they want to happen is going to take multiple generations. Elon Musk wants to colonize Mars, but that's something that he's probably not going to live to see implemented in any meaningful way. So this tension between these older people who know the evils in the world and the things that need to be sorted out, and getting people who are young enough to help them sort them out on their side, is a very realistic one, and it's a very meaningful part of the story, because as we see the things that the older generation has done to try and prepare the way for the younger generation, we see both the high points of their character and their failings. And that is a very interesting thing to see about heroes, because Kenji and his generation were extremely heroic. They weren't successful, and they have to now take the failures that they made in their generation and lay them down as the foundation for the next generation, while still convincing people that although they screwed up, they are trustworthy to show the way forward. That is a really fascinating character arc to take on, or character dynamic to show us as you try and tell a story that is fundamentally about heroism. The other major story arc here is the introduction of a witness to the killing of the Triad member, and Kana's attempts to keep the witness alive, which ultimately fails. The primary purpose here is to set up a couple of things. The Pope is coming to visit Shinjuku, and the police are out in force to try and keep everything going. At the same time, the FTP plans to assassinate someone. We don't know who, most likely the Pope. And the witness overheard these plans before the gangster was killed, because apparently this Chinese gangster was somehow in on the plan. So Detective Chono and Kana work together to try and save this witness, but unfortunately, Cho goes to a family friend. He goes to Yama, the partner of the original Cho-san, the detective that was murdered in the early part of the story. And of course, he was murdered by his partner, Yama-san. So Cho gives away the game, although he doesn't know he's giving away the game. He has no reason to think he is. One of Cho's great character struggles is between his loyalty to the police, which he views as a necessary public service, and the fact that the police have become corrupted. They've been subverted by the FDP, and they have to be restored to the original purpose. Part of that is going to mean that some people that he knows and he likes and he has respected his whole life are going to have to be exposed for the frauds they are. Eventually, Yama-san is going to have to be removed from his leadership. He's the highest ranking police officer in Japan now. That has to be dealt with before the police can be reformed and restored to the role they fulfill, which is, of course, the enforcement of the law, not the enforcement of the FDP's will. So these are major character conflicts that are going to be going forward. This conflict between the new generation and the old generation, who's not necessarily the best set of leaders, they're not the perfect set of leaders, but they are the best leaders, the best visionaries, the most aware of what's going on, and able to set a course that will solve the problem. And the younger generation, who's going to ultimately have to be the ones to solve the problem, who is going to have to do the hard work, who's going to have to do most of the fighting, that kind of thing. Except for Acho. Acho is still a badass because that's who he is. He is the coolest character in the manga, after all, and he is still incredibly formidable, even in his early 50s. I mean, just look at this panel as he digs his way out. Yeah, that man is a force to be reckoned with. Anyways, this opening of the second act does a lot of work to set up a lot of important character dynamics as we go forward. As we come to meet our new cast of characters and also be reintroduced to our old cast, beginning, of course, with Yukiji and Acho. And we see that they are still the great people we knew, but they are older, they are tempered, they are wiser, and unfortunately, they're not quite as capable as they used to be. We're going to have to see them balance all of those things and raise up the new generation to where they were in the past, maybe even beyond where they were in the past, because they didn't succeed before, if they want to win this. So this is a great setup for the middle part of the story. We're going to see some people we haven't seen for a while in the next couple of volumes, so look forward to that. And really look forward to a great unpacking of what it means to age into a new part of life. Because as I've said before, I think this story is about coming of age into every stage of life, not just adulthood, but, old age, that leadership role you're supposed to have when you're not quite as physically capable, but you are wiser, you are more experienced than the people who are going to be the next set of movers and shakers. And also the importance of having that continuity, solving really big problems. Great stuff. This continues to be a great story. As I've said, I think it does go downhill a little bit in the end, but we're still a long way from that. So tune in next time when we look at Volume 4. Let me know what you think of this part of the story down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button you can use as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.